I, for the longest time, just thought that other girls were pretending the way I was and were acting the way I was. I just thought that this was, some kind of secret agreement that all the women had to act feminine because this was godly, talk about their crushes on boys because that's what we do. But I didn't know what a crush was, but I would just say, sure, I like him.
Bridget's Twitter bio reads lesbian, celibate, and Christian. 3 words or 3 categories that seem uncomfortably impossible to reconcile. Scroll a bit further down on her feed and the discomfort only gets more palpable. When people say that I'm a sinner and degenerate because I'm gay, I say that I'm made in the image of God and proud of it. The first time I read those words, I felt uncomfortable. Bridget was challenging my prejudices and my assumptions about LGBTQ people of faith, and I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. So, in typical I'm listening fashion, I hopped on a plane and made a visit to New York City to hear from her firsthand on what life is like as someone whose very existence seems category breaking.
I had one experience when I was at a Christian summer camp where the girls were all talking about their crushes, on the camp counselors, the guy camp counselors. And I really did not have any kind of interest in any of the guy counselors. I didn't even know what they were talking about. And so they finally turned to me and they were like, what's your crush, Bridget? And I had so little understanding of how they selected their crushes. I was just like, it's probably just a random thing. And so I just pointed to the first guy counselor that I saw and I was like, I like him. And they all turned and they saw him and then they looked back at me and they just looked so confused. And they were just like, you like him? And I was like, yeah, he's got good hair. And that was all I could really say. I didn't really, could not really follow the conversation or understand what was going on. I just didn't have the feelings that I was supposed to have.
Was that a crisis for you? Was that difficult?
I wouldn't say it was a crisis. It was just more this thing that was lingering in the back of my mind where I, in college, started realizing that there were feelings that other girls had that I did not have. And finally, in my sophomore year, I called my mom up. I remember this conversation very well. I was walking around the soccer field, just kind of pacing and doing a circle around the soccer field. And I just finally asked my mom, I was like, so what is a crush? What am I supposed to feel when I feel a crush? Can you just explain it to me? Tell me what I'm supposed to feel. And so my mom kind of walked me through some of the, emotions that coincide with having a crush, butterflies in your stomach, maybe your heart starts beating a little faster, you get a little nervous, your, palms start sweating a little bit, you get kind of giddy or smiley or whatever. So she kind of walked through those feelings. And that was an aha moment for me where I was like, oh, shoot. I have totally had those feelings before, but not for a guy.
How did your family, how did your church, I guess the general community around it, how did they talk about gay people? Or was it even a topic of conversation at all?
So I can't really say that in my context growing up, homosexuality was really a specific topic of conversation. It would more come up in passing, just in reference to different things, in such a way that it's never explicitly talked about in as being the topic of conversation, but you hear it referenced enough in, side comments that you start to build a knowledge base about it just based on those comments.
What was your sense from those comments? You hear things like,
yeah, one of the first sermons that I remember hearing where homosexuality was brought up was the pastor preaching a sermon series on vessels of wrath. And
That's such a great title for.
I don't know if it was the I don't know if it was the title. And I shouldn't say it wasn't a sermon series. It was a sermon that was part of a sermon series, but the sermon itself was on the passage the vessels of wrath.
Sure.
Prepared by God for destruction. He talked about LGBTQ people as an example of vessels of wrath that were prepared by God for destruction. And he referenced Romans 1, and he explained that LGBTQ people are an example of the type of person where they were so sinful and so rebellious against God that God gave them these unnatural desires as judgment against them. And so the very fact that they had these desires was a sign of God's judgment upon them because they were so sinful that God chose to give them over to destruction. That sermon really planted itself in my mind really strongly. And
but you didn't even have your realization till years later.
No, I didn't have my realization of
Yourself.
My own experience of sexuality till years later, but that sermon kind of cemented the way I thought about queer people, which for me meant LGBTQ people are inherently sinful. They, maybe at one point weren't inherently sinful, but they chose to sin and they chose to rebel against God. And as a sign of God's judgment against them, God gave them these unnatural desires, and they are, going to hell. They are vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. So that was how that really cemented in my mind how I thought of queer people. That kind of became the locus. And, throughout my childhood, people would talk about homosexuality, LGBTQ people, always in reference to sin, always in reference to the gay agenda, trying to destroy the family, just always in reference to these very negative things with an assumption that these people are hellbound. As evidence of that, God chose to send AIDS to rid the earth of them. And there was never any explicit moments where these things were all laid out back to back. It was just referenced here and referenced there, a comment here, a comment there, where it builds this kind of conception in your mind of who queer people are. And so unbeknownst to me, I was building a conception in my mind of the person that I was. But
were there ever any kind of deviant opinions on this? Were there ever people in your life that said, maybe this isn't a healthy way to approach things? There's an alternate way of looking at some of these passages, or was it all just one cohesive message?
Within the Christian context that I was in, it was one cohesive message for me. There was no differing opinions on this. This was just, the Bible's clear truth. When I was 16, I got a job working as a cashier, and I, went out shopping with a coworker, and she was one of the first non-Christian friends that I had ever had. I didn't really have friends that weren't Christian. And, while we were out shopping, there was a gay store clerk, and she wanted to know, because she knew that I was a Christian, she wanted to know my opinion on gay people. And so, I responded with what I thought was very progressive language that, I didn't have anything against him. I'm sure he was a fine person, but, I can't condone his sin. It's not that I, as a Christian, hate gay people. It's that I hate their sin. And so it's love the sinner, hate the sin. And that was my lingo. That was the lingo that I had been given. For me, when I started realizing that I was attracted to women, it was a very jarring experience because I had been under the impression that this was not possible, that this was not a thing that could happen to someone like me, because I was a Christian. I had never like rebelled against my parents.
You try to do all the right things,
I did, I tried to do all the right things. I was very passionate about my faith. I was very sincere. I love Jesus. I love the Lord. So it was like, oh my gosh, what does this mean? And like, is there a secret? I started questioning, myself. Do I have like secret sins in my life that like I've been blind to this whole time and I'm unrepentant of? And like, this is God's judgment on me.
So you were more inclined to blame yourself than to blame God for making you a certain way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because if I'm remembering, you're saying that your view at that point was if someone finds themselves in this position, it's because they did something wrong. They're doing these things and God is punishing them, is judging them accordingly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I didn't see there being anything that like was wrong about my view of God. I just assumed there was something wrong about myself. And there was something that I had never repented of and God was judging me for. And that was coming out in this, in my life. And it, was very kind of devastating. I felt like it in some ways threw my entire salvation into question. Maybe I was never a Christian to begin with. Maybe I was self-deceived. Being Reformed, I didn't believe that I could lose my salvation. But
you might not ever
I might have never had it. I was deceived that whole time. Maybe I was never really sincere in my faith. And so I started questioning my faith and I started, really wondering and, my lowest moments, believing that it was entirely possible that I was going to spend my entire life trying to follow Jesus, but reach the end of it and discover that I was a vessel of wrath. It was like a terrifying feeling that there was nothing I could do to stop that from happening, that I was going to hell no matter what I did. And there was no way out of it. There was one night in particular where I stayed up the entire night. I'm gonna like cry. Oh wow, I didn't like expect to cry.
Can we get a tissue box or something like that? Caleb can help us out here. Take your time. This isn't the most elegant solution, but
hey, paper towels. But yeah. Yeah, there was one night that I remember very vividly. I stayed up the entire night. And I didn't want to go to sleep because I was afraid that if I closed my eyes, I wouldn't open them again. And I would awake in the fires of hell, that God was going to kill me because he was so angry with the way I had turned out and with my sin. And he was just so disgusted with who I was that he was just going to blot me out from the face of the earth, because that's what he had created me for anyhow, because I was a vessel of wrath. I don't know if I can say, like, I had a moment of being like, oh my gosh, the truth, Jesus loves me. I'm not afraid anymore. Haha. Like, I can't say there was like a moment like that, but I definitely did have a period of time where I was like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I can't live like this. I can't do this.
Now, this might seem like an odd place to pause in our conversation, but I want to encourage you guys to stay tuned because in our next episode with Bridget, we're planning on confronting one of the most discouraging statistics that I've ever heard of regarding religion.
There was a study that came out just a few years ago that showed religious affiliation tends to reduce suicidal ideation. It reduces suicidal ideation in almost every demographic. But for LGBTQ people, it increases suicidal ideation. The more committed that a gay person is to their faith, the more likely they are to commit suicide.